This is the tale of Mr. Honey. Mr. Honey is who? He is the subject of this tale, and it is his convictions that show us what he must do. Mr. Honey is an aircraft researcher for a government research firm. He specializes in aircraft structures under continuous oscillating loads, what eventually ends in fatigue failure. From our modern perspective, dealing with fatigue failure in aircraft structures, among other kinds, is well established and practiced. Circa 1948, however, the possibility that an aircraft can just come to pieces without useful forewarning would be a phenomenon so strange it could have been ascribed to airborne gremlins, magical creatures on whom inexplicable aircraft problems are blamed. For aviation in this time of history in Honey's story, most aircraft before this point don't end their lives by falling apart on their own, but by being destroyed by deliberate action, military combat, catastrophic accidents in aircraft mishandling, pilot error, or equipment failure, engines and other similarly vital components failing from poor, unreliable design. Compared to all aviation development beforehand, knowledge of the limits on airframe lifespan was truly a new frontier. It just so happens that this is also the time where knowledge of matter on the atomic level, nuclear physics, was becoming widespread after the end of World War II and the atomic bombs. In Honey's view, the new zeitgeist of atomic knowledge is the key to understanding material behavior on the larger scale. In real life, aviation and material science, fatigue is not so minutely related to nuclear physics, but for this story, Honey's conviction of this connection is key to the story's drama. Our point of view for the whole story comes mostly from Honey's boss, Dr. Scott, who relays his own experiences and those of others told to him. Dr. Scott begins the story looking over the work of the scientists and researchers and deciding who was doing important work for the benefit of British aviation and who would be better being reassigned or retired. When Dr. Scott comes across Mr. Honey, he finds a diminutive man utterly focused on his particularly unique project, taking an aircraft's tail and placing it under flight loads in controlled conditions and flying it for at least as many hours as his personal mathematical estimate would see it come apart from metal fatigue. This estimate, 1,440 hours, becomes a focal point for the investigation that follows, and for all the stakeholders of that fictional aircraft. As far as Mr. Honey, as well as Dr. Scott, is concerned, at first, the possibility that a passenger carrying reindeer will risk a deadly accident by fatigue failure is a distant prospect. They presume they have time to complete the research using Honey's reindeer tail, and investigating the one accident of a reindeer they know about to determine if a reindeer tail comes to pieces at 1,440 hours. It's still an important task since passengers' lives are and would be on the line, and fatigue failure in aircraft is not yet greatly understood. So Dr. Scott and the Royal Aircraft Establishment start to take action. He wants Mr. Honey's calculations and his estimate corroborated with the knowledge of another agency, one having to do with nuclear physics. Honey, however, isn't receptive to this course. He has problems connecting with and persuading people, even other professionals like himself, so that even if his scientific research is sound, Honey fears it will be dismissed out of hand on account of his off-putting visage. Not to mention that Honey doesn't want to be assigned credibility where his estimates have not been backed up by recorded data. He'd prefer to wait for the test to run to completion before going and presenting his estimate as a definite finding before its time. As far as Honey is concerned, the full scientific method must be adhered to, or it's a waste. But Dr. Scott has another more urgent reason to push Honey out of his professional zone, not to mention his comfort zone. It is the simple discovery that the one reindeer accident so far involved an airframe that was flown very closely to the estimated 1440-hour mark, and no one else is seeing red flags. Before Dr. Scott in story, literally no one else suspected that the one reindeer airframe that had the most flight hours by far would be the first to succumb to something like fatigue failure, old age for airplanes. The lives of the passengers and crew could have been spared if someone had, maybe not just anyone, but at least one of several individuals invested in aviation and its safety, might have spared the imagination to foresee the possibility and save lives ahead of time. So Scott decides to act on this possibility. In the mindset of an administrator and one of a few at the forefront of aviation and its safety, Dr. Scott puts together a plan. He will get Honey, his premier expert on fatigue failure in aircraft, to go to the accident site in Canada and collect evidence to determine if it fell thanks to a fatigue failure. Meanwhile, Scott will get the airline to pause their reindeer flights at half of Honey's estimated flight hours to failure, so that passengers can be protected. This is where our characters start to butt heads with other authorities in British civil aviation, and especially their egos. But before the headbutting starts, Mr. Honey, while starting his journey on Dr. Scott's behalf, gets to start his own drama in a most dramatic fashion. While taking a transatlantic flight to Canada, he discovers the aircraft he is flying in is a reindeer. At first, he can marvel at its comforts and amenities, and especially the attentiveness of the flight attendants. When he gets invited to the flight deck, he gets to marvel at the engineering that went into the aircraft, not to mention indulge his curiosity of astral navigation. Then the other shoe drops. He discovers the very aircraft he is flying in has flown just over 1,400 hours. As far as Honey is concerned, he himself and everyone on that flight is as close to death as ever they could be, with just one cosmic dice throw away from a fatigue failure, losing them the horizontal stabilizer, and dropping them into the Atlantic. Before Honey left for Canada, Dr. Scott makes his position clear. No reindeer aircraft should fly more than 700 flight hours until they can determine how much danger fatigue failure poses to flight safety. Now Honey is alone, the only one on a passenger flight who recognizes their danger. And from that point, it's a struggle to convince the crew to act on that risk, fighting both their incredulity and his own severely lackluster charisma. The farthest he gets is to convince the more sympathetic Flight Captain Samuelson to adjust the engines, to buy themselves time by breaking up the harmonics in the structure. Once safely landed, Mr. Honey's fears are acted on, with the local ground crew and safety inspector looking over the aircraft tail structure, only to see nothing apparently amiss. No obvious surface cracking, no corrosion, nothing outside to show a fault inside the tail spar. Now Honey knows that a fatigue crack wouldn't be visible from the surface of a material, and anyone knowledgeable of aircraft structures today would also know that a fatigue crack in a structure might only be visible via a non-invasive inspection technique, such as ultrasound or radiograph. But that knowledge is not widespread in the story setting, and the tools are years away from conception. At that point in the story, Honey is failing to convey his knowledge, and his conviction to act on the danger at hand is not being reciprocated by the people around him. This is where Mr. Honey makes a fateful choice. Either give up and let the plane fly on and imperil the crew and passengers to a deadly crash, or do something truly drastic. A series of seemingly random circumstances come together to allow Honey his one course of action. An auxiliary power unit left running to light and heat the aircraft, and also a faulty safety circuit for the landing gear. The flight crew make no special note of it, just something for common maintenance to take care of in due time. Honey notices these things independently, and thus When his words fail, his convictions inform his move. He literally grounds the reindeer by pulling the control to retract the landing gear. From this point, there is no going back. For Mr. Honey's convictions and Dr. Scott's faith in Honey's scientific knowledge, the cause of accident by fatigue failure must be proven or disproven without question. Their credibility and their future in aviation is now at stake. It is after this point Dr. Scott, back in Britain, gets propelled into meeting various people with various views on Honey, his actions, and the reindeer aircraft itself. Before going into the nuances of each position, however, it is worth summarizing that the many different people our protagonists interact with are not really their own nuanced characters, but embodiments of ego. And not just any ego, but the kind of ego that coerces others into inaction. Before sending Honey to investigate the accident, Dr. Scott goes to the accidents branch and Group Captain Fisher, who headed up the initial investigation into the crash. Fisher's ego is meant to convey that he and his group did their due diligence and could not have missed any outstanding evidence to suggest a cause not before considered. Any suggestion to the contrary would be tantamount to a personal affront. This would be especially acute given the written backstory of the accident branch making a similar mistake in a previous investigation. Nonetheless, the initial accident report gives Dr. Scott the initial lead to convince him to use Honey and look further into the accident, and the danger of fatigue failure not before identified. After Honey's fateful choice, the rest of the stakeholders come into the picture, and just like rutting reindeer, they butt heads over the Rutland reindeer. Representing the real historical British Overseas Airways Corporation, a state-owned airline, are Moon and Carnegie. And representing the fictional aircraft manufacturer Rutland Aircraft Corporation is Prendergast. They butt heads with Dr. Scott and his director over the need to ground reindeer aircraft at half of Honey's estimated time to failure. Moon and Carnegie, essentially bargaining like profit-seeking businessmen, try to convince Dr. Scott to work with a lesser factor of safety so that passenger-carrying revenue is not cut into, not to mention avoiding the specter of bad publicity, essentially appealing to economic and political prestige, not to mention the fallacy of a false dilemma. If we're so worried about passenger safety, then we might as well stop flying. When the topic shifts to Honey, the man behind the estimated time to failure for reindeer aircraft, all parties start questioning Honey's character, once again leaving out any question of risks to passengers. While Moon and Carnegie are content to consider Honey as mentally unbalanced, Dr. Scott stands up for Honey, taking Honey's action as an extension of his own moral authority to foresee and prevent a fatal danger to passengers. Prendergast, presuming to have a unique insight into the character and mentality of the typical scientific researcher, chooses to smear Honey's character by appealing to the weirdness of Honey's work outside of the Royal Aircraft establishment. The director of the RAE stands up for Honey and all his civil servant researchers on the grounds that what makes them good researchers is not limited to official business, no matter how unorthodox or esoteric. In all this back and forth, no one, other than Dr. Scott, his director, and the RAE, is concerned by the costs of any new reindeer accidents to British aeronautical prestige and the public trust at large. The top management of BOAC is more than content to cry for the cost of Honey's wrecked reindeer and the loss of revenue besides, but seemingly not thinking ahead as to the cost incurred when passengers find out they neglected a deadly aircraft design flaw. Nevertheless, without substantial evidence to support Dr. Scott's and the RAE's recommendation, everyone is content to change nothing. That is, until the pilot from Honey's wrecked reindeer is invited to speak. With a seniority equal to Prendergast and his own credibility in BOAC, Flight Captain Samuelson rejects the notion that the first reindeer accident was due to pilot error, the kind of error only a novice pilot would make. What involved his equally experienced colleague, the late Bill Ward. Where Honey's convictions could be easily brushed off as those of an obvious nervous crank, Samuelson's convictions carry more weight. Where Honey is a civil servant looked down on by so many others, the pilot Samuelson is a trusted professional. And where Honey's sanity is questioned for his impulse to incur damages, Samuelson is seen as unfettered due to his stake in a stable career. Thanks to Samuelson's convictions, opposition and outright disbelief in Dr. Scott's safety concern is quelled for the time being. Even the prideful aircraft designer Prendergast is convinced to take measures acting on the possibility of the structural weakness in the reindeer tail. Now comes the final stretch and the final hurdles to the investigation of the reindeer. Dr. Scott makes his way to Canada and the crash site of the first reindeer to fall, while Honey returns to Britain. When Dr. Scott goes to examine the reindeer tail, another cruel twist of circumstance turns up. The Russians have stolen part of the tail structure. Thanks to Russian insecurities and projection of a Western plot to assassinate their ambassador, part of the most crucial evidence for the investigation is locked behind the Iron Curtain. This leaves Dr. Scott no choice but to find the missing tailplane. When news of the mishap gets back to Honey and company in Britain, Honey searches his convictions one more time to finally close the case. Throughout the story, Dr. Scott and the reader get to hear much of Honey's more esoteric pursuits. The lost tribes of Israel, the prophecy of the Great Pyramid, the end of the world coming in 1994, and the utility of automatic writing. Throughout the story, these pursuits are taken as a mark against Honey's intellect and sanity, at least until Dr. Scott finds out that Honey examines these ideas in the utmost scientific manner. The meaning behind an intellect like Honey taking so heartily to such ideas is a separate discussion. What comes into play in the final hour of the story is that Honey decides to put his esoteric knowledge to use. By putting his daughter Elspeth in a trance and directing her focus onto Dr. Scott's plight in Canada, Honey extracts a note, ostensibly from the other side, via planchette or automatic writing, that's supposed to help Dr. Scott find the missing tailplane. But to preserve the credibility of the Royal Aircraft establishment, the director refuses to cable the information to Canada. It takes Honey and the stewardess Corder making a plea to the pilot Samuelson to take his passenger flight out of the way and personally drop the message to Dr. Scott. With a little local knowledge from Dr. Scott's companions, they figure out what place the message could be referring to. Flying to the place reveals for them the missing tailplane. After finally getting this break, Dr. Scott, Mr. Honey, and the Royal Aircraft establishment are validated in their concerns for the flight safety of the reindeer and its tail. BOAC acquiesces to scheduling their reindeers for grounding and modification, which, fortuitously, are made ready by Prendergast and the Rutland Aircraft Corporation. Passengers are spared a deadly hazard. British prestige for aircraft is maintained. Honey gets validated again when his tail experiment finally concludes. And Dr. Scott has a new story to write about as he goes on to the next aircraft investigation. I started by saying this was a tale of Mr. Honey's convictions, but it should be clear. It was the convictions of Mr. Honey, Dr. Scott, the RAE director, pilot Samuelson, and stewardess Corder that showed them all what must be done. And so they did. Which brings up a question. Why all the esoteric studies and philosophies? Whatever attitudes were towards these ideas, circa 1948, now, more than 70 years later, these ideas do not amount to much, especially not scientifically. Any adherence to Jesus coming back to Earth via Britain, a la A Great Pyramid Prophecy in 1994, with a kind of world-ending / changing impact, is the kind of idea more fit for modern mythology, and especially cults of conspiracy theory. So for this story, why should a character like Mr. Honey hold these esoteric ideas with such credence? I think there's at least two angles to answer this question: the in-universe personal psychological reasoning, and the narrative reason framing the story. Now, a disclaimer: I'm not a well-read, studied, or trained psychologist or psychoanalyst or anything of the sort. Indeed, a voice on the internet claiming expertise where they have none would be exactly on brand for this kind of commentary. Let's do it. What we know of Mr. Honey's character as written is that he had a wife, Mary, with whom he has his daughter, Elspeth. But during World War II, a German V-2 rocket attack sees Mary killed, leaving Honey alone to raise his infant daughter while still working as a research scientist. As brilliant as Honey is concerning the structural physics of aircraft, maintaining that brilliance along with raising a child and maintaining an orderly home is beyond his abilities. It's no stretch to think that the grief of losing his loving wife and the stress of being a single parent, combined with latent insecurities and social awkwardness, now without the support and intimacy of a trusted partner to help him, this would contribute to Honey looking for comfort and guidance from the metaphysical while neglecting his worldly condition. Using his scientific rigor, his personal writings indicate some of the meaning behind his findings, what's left unspecified to us. That any information gleaned has no bearing on the seeker's intent or awareness of the intended recipient, for the knowledge at hand can only be applied for a kind of greater good. When Honey is conferring with Monica Teasdale on their flight to Gander, he explains why he studies and shares his ideas of the Great Pyramid Prophecy. He feels a certain responsibility, to his daughter for one, to prepare people for a nebulous future, approximately 1994, where the world as they know it will end or be fundamentally changed, in a way that's something like rapture or a return to Earth of Jesus in Britain. In Honey's words, the principle of goodness will nullify the discrepancies and disagreements between religions and cultures, and it's his duty to use his knowledge and scientific rigor to prepare people, or at least his daughter, who will live to see this change and live with it. Honey's belief in upholding this principle of goodness, I suspect, is at the heart of his convictions for when he does act, despite his nervous personality. When Honey learns of how close the reindeer he's flying in is to the flight hour time to failure, he begs the flight crew to act on it. Not just to fly differently, but to land and not roll the cosmic dice. When his pleas are ignored and the flight goes on, he finds a possible safe place to survive an imminent crash, and endeavors to tell his film idol, Monica Teasdale, who is also on the flight. When he's first ignored by Teasdale, he tells the stewardess, Marjorie Corder, in a way to repay her for her kindness and attention, her job notwithstanding. When Monica comes around to converse with Honey, he extols the value he and his late wife saw in her filmography, even despite the actress's own aged cynicism. Between Honey, stewardess Corder, and actress Teasdale, there's an understanding that if, and seemingly when, disaster strikes, whatever Honey's intention for the two women to survive, they all seem to have an understanding of their characters, that they will face the danger, even facing certain death to do so. Corder will have her duty to prepare and protect the passengers in the emergency, and Honey will go to the flight deck and offer any help his aeronautical knowledge just might allow. Monica Teasdale herself doesn't expect to do much in case of disaster, except go to the men's lavatory, as Honey says. But she does vouch for him to the pilot, Samuelson, to allow his assistance should there be any in-flight incident. Between Honey's plausible warning concerning aircraft structures and the charismatic persuasion of Monica Teasdale vouching for his character, It should be no wonder that pilot Samuelson defends Honey's credibility later in story. When they land at Gander, and the flight crew decides to continue the flight, despite Honey's insistence of the danger, he decides to ground the reindeer aircraft personally in one lever pull. To Corder and Teasdale, I expect this comes off as an act of true courage, saving the unknowing passengers of a seemingly imminent peril. Meanwhile, pilot Samuelson, despite being compelled in his pilot authority to continue the flight, is apparently relieved for Honey taking the nerve-wracking decision out of his hands. And then there's Dobson. We got Dobson here. No one cares. Basically, the rest of the flight crew exist only to be incredulous at Honey in the easiest, most straightforward way possible. Their professional pride will not allow them to consider that this funny-looking and meek little man might know something they don't about their aircraft, much less that they and the passengers might be in imminent danger. However, there is one character who has a surprising arc, and it has to do with how different their character seems to a man like Honey, but maybe more similar than we might have guessed. Prendergast. Like any ghastly figure, Prendergast, the aircraft designer behind the Rutland reindeer, has a combination of seniority, prestige, and pride that's tailor-made to cow others into not critically examining him or his work. He's also not above personal attacks on supposed lesser individuals, nor threatening others with his absence, for when he decides he's not being properly valued for his skill. Essentially, where would your prestige in aviation be without me? Such is his self-evaluation. Then comes the turns in character. First, in the meeting where Prendergast's views of the lowly Honey are made clear, he hears the airline pilot Samuelson defend the credibility of Honey's hypothesis, and so is, reluctantly, compelled to act on the possibility of a true weakness in the reindeer design. Second, when Honey returns to his work from Canada, Prendergast meets him and seeks Honey's mathematical and theoretical work that informs his estimate of flight hours to fatigue failure. Throughout that episode, Prendergast says next to nothing, simply grunting in response to Honey's labored words. Here's where I think the presumption of the narration is misleading. The meeting between Honey and Prendergast presumes that Prendergast is not really listening to Honey, much less giving him his due consideration as a man of scientific research. Come story's end, however, when evidence of fatigue failure is finally found and brought back for study, it becomes clear that Prendergast wasted no time acting on the possibility of its truth, and as part of the Rutland Aircraft Company, devised plans and allocated resources for structural modifications to the reindeer aircraft in service, and in such a fortuitous manner that the flying public need never know how close they came to flying in death traps. The written fact that Prendergast was so proactive and prepared for this contingency doesn't speak of a man so dismissive as he appeared. When the narration said was Prendergast's dismissal of Honey's scientific work, would be better described in hindsight as acknowledgement and quiet attentiveness to the work Honey was presenting. The story presents Honey and Prendergast as vastly different in character. Honey is meek, while Prendergast is imposing. Honey has a fragile ego, while Prendergast's ego makes others fragile. Honey takes an interest in the metaphysical, while Prendergast is firmly entrenched in the power structure of government and industry. But taking the story in totality, I see some more fundamental similarities in Honey and Prendergast, even while it's not explicitly written. Both Honey and Prendergast are prideful in their work ethic, even to the point of losing their composure or neglecting the feelings of others. Both suffer the weakness that their foibles make them unapproachable to others, even when it behooves them to listen to a perspective outside their headspace. And both fundamentally do act for a kind of greater good, even if they don't wholly articulate their actions as such. and Honey and Prendergast are both fundamentally competent in their disciplines. From a certain perspective, Prendergast might be taken as a version of Honey that overcomes his awkwardness and sensitive ego by being imposing, inscrutable, and strategic in how vulnerable he makes himself to others. This comes around to what theme I think frames the story of this fictional air accident investigation. Upholding aviation safety and public trust in the same is sometimes not just a serious business or an act of rigor and scientific investigation, but also fundamentally an act of faith. Faith in people entrusted in aviation, even funny little people like one Mr. Honey, and professionals like airline pilot Samuelson. Faith in dutiful civil servants like Dr. Scott and the RAE. In the seemingly insignificant people like a kind and sympathetic flight stewardess Marjorie Corder. And even faith in someone high and mighty as a prideful aircraft designer like Prendergast. Just like in Macefield's poem, "Therefore go forth, companion, adventure on, more wonders are in thee. Adventure on, for from the littlest clue, the next to lighten all men may be you."